And we will always be protecting ICE, and we're always going to be protecting our Border Patrol and our law enforcement. Yeah.
In Minnesota, the White House is calling it a drawdown. 700 federal immigration officers are being pulled out effective immediately, according to public reporting. But the number that matters is what remains. Roughly 2,000 federal personnel still on the ground. This is not an ending. It is a visible adjustment forced by pressure, local officials demanding an exit, courts refusing to grant an instant shutdown, and a public record shaped by confrontations that turn deadly. The operation has become a test of whether Trump can control a crisis he created, or whether Minnesota will control him through law, process, and resistance. Trump's posture in Minnesota was simple: flood the zone, then call it order. According to public reporting, federal agencies pushed an immigration enforcement surge into the Twin Cities area and treated scale itself as leverage masked teams, visible presence, and a message that federal power could override local resistance. The miscalculation was assuming that volume equals control. In Minnesota, volume created an evidentiary trail. Each extra officer expanded the surface area for complaints, documentation, and litigation. Local leaders did not treat the surge as routine enforcement. They described it as an intrusion that disrupted daily life and public safety. According to public reporting, the governor and the Minneapolis mayor demanded the operation end, not merely shrink. That matters because it reframes the conflict as sovereignty and governance, not just immigration. The deeper blind spot was operational. Trump's team still needed local systems to function. Even the most aggressive federal posture runs into a practical wall when jails, courts, and prosecutors will not reshape their processes on command. According to public reporting, the White House signaled it would monitor local officials to ensure cooperation. That is not dominance. It is a confession that the surge depends on institutions Trump does not control. Institutional constraint arrived fast. A federal judge declined to order an immediate end to the crackdown, but the ruling itself underscored the real limit on Trump's leverage. The operation could not be ended or validated by presidential messaging alone. It had to survive scrutiny, filings, and competing claims about legality and harm. When a court says it is not making a final determination, it is also saying the story is not closed. The negative consequences were already baked in. According to public reporting, 2 U.S. citizens were fatally shot by federal officers during the weeks of upheaval. Allegations of unlawful detentions and aggressive tactics circulated alongside sustained protests. Even if contested details are fought over later, the political damage is immediate. Trump's surge becomes a referendum on force, not a demonstration of competence. At that point, Trump's options narrowed. Staying all in meant carrying the cost of every new incident and every new filing. Retreating meant admitting that Minnesota could not be subdued by spectacle. The surge turned into a pressure chamber that tightened every day it remained in place. The administration's drawdown announcement was designed to look like command. According to public reporting, Tom Homan said 700 federal officers would be withdrawn immediately after state and local officials agreed to cooperate by turning over certain arrested immigrants. The number itself was presented as decisive, but it was also described as roughly a quarter of the total deployed. Trump reinforced the framing by suggesting the reduction reflected a lesson about using a softer touch, while insisting toughness would remain. The posture was not retreat, it was rebranding. The blind spot is that drawdowns are read by everyone watching as a measure of control, and the remaining number exposed weakness. Roughly 2,000 federal officers still staying in Minnesota is not a calm-down figure. It is a statement that the surge continues, only slightly reconfigured. Local officials treated the announcement as an insufficient first step, not a breakthrough, because the scale still dominates the streets and the headlines. According to public reporting, the Department of Homeland Security had described the surge as the largest immigration enforcement operation ever. A label like that raises expectations, then punishes failure. This is where institutions squeeze the White House. According to public reporting, the rationale for reducing the footprint depended on jail-based transfers. Fewer street operations if people are taken into ICE custody from local facilities. That dependence flips the power dynamic. Trump can send agents, but he cannot force county sheriffs, city jails, and prosecutors to become extension cords for federal goals without creating new legal risk. Minnesota officials have argued that holding people beyond release times without proper judicial authority is unlawful, and local jail policies have been described as requiring warrants for handovers. The administration's own monitoring language deepens the problem. According to public reporting, the White House promised to monitor local officials to make sure commitments are kept. Monitoring is what you do when the other side can defect. It turns a federal crackdown into a compliance management exercise, exactly the opposite of Trump's preferred image of unilateral command. It also widens the blast radius. If cooperation stalls, the White House must either escalate again or accept that local institutions can throttle enforcement. Negative consequences were not erased by removing 700 bodies from the field. The drawdown does nothing to unwind weeks of public friction or to neutralize the record of shootings, protests, and allegations now tied to the operation's name. It also does not remove the court track. A judge's refusal to end the surge immediately keeps Minnesota in a live legal dispute where operational decisions can be cited, challenged, and preserved. According to public reporting, 2 school districts and a teachers' union filed a lawsuit seeking to block immigration enforcement at or around schools, saying actions disrupted classes, endangered students, and drove attendance down. Trump's remaining options tightened further. If he reduces the footprint enough to satisfy local leaders, he admits the surge was politically unsustainable. If he tries to hold the middle, he inherits the worst of both worlds: a continuing federal presence that fuels anger and a partial retreat that signals weakness. If he keeps a massive force in place, he extends the period in which more incidents, more documentation, and more lawsuits can accumulate. When the White House has to bargain to make its enforcement workable, it is already operating inside someone else's constraints. The line in the headlines they're leaving is the most misleading part of this story. 700 leaving changes the optics for a day. The force that still will not go away is the system that produced the surge in the first place. A federal enforcement machine that has to keep moving to justify its own disruption. According to public reporting, the drawdown leaves roughly 2,000 federal immigration and border personnel in Minnesota. The Washington Post reported that the overall federal footprint had swollen to about 3,000 during the peak, compared with roughly 80 officers in the Minneapolis area before the operation began, citing court records. Even after the reduction, that scale is still far beyond typical enforcement levels. Trump's decision-making pattern is visible here. He treats enforcement as a political scene. A surge arrives, the message is dominance, and opposition is supposed to fold. The miscalculation is that institutions do not fold to scenes. They grind. And grinding creates constraints that accumulate and do not reset when the White House changes its talking points. Start with the local layer, because it is the one Trump cannot erase with federal authority. According to public reporting, Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey said the withdrawal of 700 officers was only a first step and demanded the operation end quickly. Frey publicly framed keeping about 2,000 agents as not a de-escalation. When local leaders frame federal enforcement as a threat rather than a partnership, the White House loses the ability to claim legitimacy by presence alone. That leads to the second layer, operational dependence that turns a show of force into a bargaining problem. According to public reporting, Homan tied further reductions to cooperation from local and state law enforcement. The Guardian described negotiations over county jails coordinating with federal officials, including discussions of notifying agents before releases so pickups can happen in jail rather than on the street. The logic is mechanical. If enforcement can be routed through custody transfers, fewer teams are needed outside. The White House made that dependence explicit. According to public reporting carried by the Associated Press and republished by WTOP, the press secretary said the administration would monitor local officials to make sure they keep their commitments. Monitoring is not triumph. It is a sign of vulnerability. It says the federal operation is now partially hostage to compliance by institutions that can slow walk, litigate, or decline. Minnesota's constraints are embedded in rules about how long a person can be held, when a warrant is required, and who has custody at what moment. According to public reporting, the county jails serving Minneapolis and St. Paul have emphasized that they will hand over inmates when there is a judicial warrant, and have resisted blanket cooperation that would treat detainers as automatic. That kind of detail destroys Trump's preferred framing. It suggests federal power is being filtered through local legality. Now the third layer, and the one that turns this into a climax: accountability that cannot be redeployed out of state. According to public reporting, the surge became a flashpoint after 2 U.S. citizens were fatally shot by federal officers during the period of unrest. Those deaths are not simply tragic incidents. They are narrative anchors that shift the entire operation into a legitimacy crisis. Every decision that follows is judged through that lens, and every statement from Washington is tested against it. Courts then lock the legitimacy crisis into a timetable Trump cannot compress. On January 31, according to public reporting by the Washington Post, a federal judge denied Minnesota's request for an immediate end to the surge, while emphasizing that the case was still in its infancy. That posture is slow, procedural, and punishing for Trump's style of politics. It means the operation remains active while the record is built. Filings, declarations, and documented disruptions. The White House cannot declare closure when a court keeps the file open. The administration tried to counter with scale language of its own. According to public reporting, the Department of Homeland Security described the surge as its largest immigration enforcement operation ever, and Homan warned that the mission of mass deportations continues even as officers depart. This pivot fails on contact with reality. Largest ever may sound like strength, but it also raises the stakes of scrutiny. A large operation produces a large footprint, and a large footprint produces more points of failure. And the constraints do not stop at the state lawsuit. According to public reporting, 2 school districts and a teachers' union filed a lawsuit seeking to block immigration enforcement at or around schools, arguing disruption, safety concerns, and attendance drops. The administration answered by insisting it was not targeting children. But the lawsuit itself is the point. It expands the legal perimeter around the surge and forces the White House to defend tactics in places the public treats as off-limits. This is why the force that still won't go away is accurate in the most damaging way for Trump. The force is not merely personnel. It is a chain of constraints. Local officials who refuse to bless the operation, county systems that can limit cooperation, and court proceedings that keep the crackdown under scrutiny. Trump can move 700 officers like chess pieces, but he cannot relocate the institutional memory that Minnesota is now building. By the time the drawdown is announced, Trump's options are narrowed to losing choices. If he draws down further, he validates the premise that the surge was excessive and politically toxic. If he holds at 2,000 or more, he sustains the conditions that produced outrage and lawsuits, increasing the chance that the next headline is worse than the last. If he tries to convert the operation into a quieter, jail-based pipeline, he hands leverage to the very local institutions he wanted to intimidate. The drawdown is not a release of pressure. Every day it continues, the political cost compounds in public. It is the moment the pressure becomes permanent. After the drawdown, Trump's team tried to sell a new storyline. The surge is being refined, not repudiated. The problem is that refinement is exactly what happens when an institution forces you to adapt. According to public reporting, Homan framed the reduction as a product of increased collaboration and safer conditions. The White House framed it as oversight-enabled success. But the public record reads differently. The federal footprint is being resized because the original scale became politically and legally expensive. Even inside the administration's own language, the posture is reactive. According to public reporting, Homan said his goal was a complete drawdown and an end to the surge as soon as we can. That phrase is not a timeline. It is a hedge, and it signals that timing is now dictated by conditions on the ground, cooperation, court posture, and the temperature of public resistance. Trump is no longer setting the schedule. He is waiting for the environment to let him exit. The court track is the clearest institutional constraint. A judge's refusal to order an immediate end does not grant Trump a blank check. It keeps the operation in a contested posture where litigation can continue and discovery can widen. According to public reporting, the judge acknowledged evidence of disruptions and allegations of excessive force, while stressing she was not ruling on those claims at that stage. That distinction matters. It means the most damaging allegations are not defeated, they are deferred. Accountability pressure also forces procedural changes. According to public reporting from CBS Minnesota, officials said every federal officer in Minneapolis would soon have a body camera. That is an institutional adaptation to controversy, and it carries a clear implication. The operation is now treated as a liability that must be recorded, reviewed, and defended. Body cameras do not solve the legitimacy problem. They create a permanent archive of it. Meanwhile, the White House's dependence on local cooperation becomes a long-term vulnerability. According to public reporting, the administration wants more arrests to happen in jails rather than on the street. But jail-based routing makes federal goals contingent on county policies, state law, and the willingness of local officials to keep absorbing political risk for Trump. CBS Minnesota also reported state corrections leadership describing de-escalation details as sketchy, which underscores how little control Washington actually has over implementation. There is also the optics trap. When local leaders say 2,000 agents isn't a de-escalation, the White House cannot reclaim calm simply by changing the number on a slide. The continued presence keeps the community in a heightened posture, and it keeps federal officers operating under a cloud of suspicion. The negative consequences compound in the open. The drawdown does not erase weeks of fear or disruption, nor does it end the shadow cast by the killings and the allegations of unlawful detentions. It also does not end scrutiny from lawmakers, local media, and national outlets documenting the effects on schools, workplaces, and public services. The longer a large federal force remains, the more those institutions must respond legal counsel, safety adjustments, and administrative work, making the surge's damage self-perpetuating. Trump's options narrow again. A deeper pullback risks confirming that the surge was a strategic error. Holding position invites a prolonged legitimacy fight with courts, local leaders, and public opinion. A president who wanted a quick demonstration of control is now trapped in slow governance, where every move generates more constraint. Trump wants the Minnesota episode to end as a manageable adjustment. 700 leaving, the rest staying, the mission continuing. According to public reporting, that is the official posture. But the operational reality is harsher. This drawdown did not remove the force that matters most. It left behind the institutional memory of a surge that local leaders called catastrophic, a court process that keeps the dispute alive, and a compliance dependency that turns federal power into a negotiating position. The miscalculation was treating a surge like a lever you pull once. In practice, it is a machine that produces consequences faster than messaging can contain them. 2 fatal shootings by federal officers during the surge period, according to public reporting, changed the moral center of the story. Allegations of unlawful detentions and aggressive tactics widened the legitimacy gap. Lawsuits by the state and by school districts and a teachers' union expanded the arena into public services and sensitive locations. Even the administration's adjustments reveal constraint. According to public reporting, officials signaled that body cameras would be required for federal officers operating in Minneapolis. That is not a symbol of confidence. It is a symbol of exposure, because every future encounter becomes recorded evidence. And when Homan says a complete drawdown will happen as soon as we can, he is admitting that Trump's exit depends on conditions he does not dictate. Institutional resistance now shapes Trump's remaining options. If he draws down further, he validates the charge that the surge was an overreach that endangered public safety. If he holds the line near 2,000, he sustains the conditions that keep litigation, scrutiny, and public anger active. If he tries to shift the operation into jail-based transfers, he becomes dependent on the very local systems he tried to pressure, and the White House ends up monitoring cooperation like a supervisor, not leading like a president. This is what losing leverage looks like in slow motion. Minnesota is no longer a place Trump controls with force. It is a place that controls Trump with process. If you want more fact-locked breakdowns of how institutions trap presidential power, subscribe for the next episode.